Hello and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. My name is Ben Amond, and today I'm going to be showing you how to create the shaders in this last part of our fantasy-themed weapon tutorial series. Now when I was creating this, I was loosely basing it off of a already designed weapon. It's actually called the Death Sickle from the indie game Terraria, and you can see a larger image of it here. And as you can see, it has sort of the same design. I added an extra blade on the back and sort of changed the length of certain parts and whatnot, but it's based off of this design. So I'm going to be doing the same thing with the shaders, because I kind of like the dark purple black effect that it has going on with the colors. So that's sort of the style I'm going to be using on the weapon when we get to work on it. So let me just close this. I want to work with 4 shaders here, because I want sort of a dark wood shader to go along the staff right here. I want a gem shader for the gems, of course. I want a gold shader for the little rings around the gems, because that makes it stand out a little more and makes it look a little more, I don't know, polished. And of course the metal texture for the blades. So let's get started on that. First we're going to start with this wood texture, just because, or this wood shader, just because it's one of the few things we're going to have to be UV mapping today. So I'm going to split my view, and I'm going to switch this right window into the image editor. And for this, I'm going to use a texture that I pulled off of CG Textures as usual. All of the textures that I'm going to be using today are from there, so I'll post links to those in the description of this video and beneath this video on my site. But let me just go ahead and open that so you can see what it is. I believe it was under right here, and I'm just going to use this wood texture right here. Okay, now this texture isn't tileable if I remember correctly, so that means we're probably going to have to do a little texture painting to get it to look good. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and press tab to go into edit mode, and we want to apply this mirror modifier, as I can see, because I forgot to do that earlier, because we'll run into some texturing problems potentially if we don't do that now. So press tab to go back into object mode, come over here to the modifiers panel, and apply the mirror modifier. Okay. Yeah, that should be good. So the next thing we want to do is hold down Alt and right click this edge loop. It just runs along the entire side of the thing. It basically cuts the staff in half. And this is what we're going to be using for the seam. So we can just go ahead and press Ctrl E and mark seam. So now really all we have to do is press A to select everything, U to unwrap, and just choose unwrap, and it unwraps them 2 nice, neat little halves that we can work with and sort of scale these and rotate them and manipulate them to get what we want. Before we do anything else though, I'm going to split my view here and change this upper window to the node editor, and we're just going to add a new shader, move these over, press Shift A, add a texture, an image texture, click on the little image icon, load that texture, and connect the color output to the color input there, so that when we switch the view here from solid to textured, we can actually see what we're doing. And as you can see, there is of course a texture seam, where I said there would be, because it's where we marked the seam. And we can fix that through texture painting once we've mapped this to the way we want it to be. So to do that, I'm just going to rotate this 90 degrees by pressing R, 90. And of course I'm doing that because I want it to follow the grain of the wood. Instead of it going horizontally on here, I want it to go vertically, follow the staff. And then we can go ahead and scale this up nice and big. Something like that will work just fine. Alright. So, it looks like I might actually... Now we can work with that a little bit more later. Okay. So, now we want to go ahead and take care of these texture seams, because we can definitely see some of them here. It looks like there are also some going, of course, horizontally as well as vertically. And it's not too important to take care of these. I say that because a lot of times, especially with the size that we have this at, it's not really going to be that visible, especially after we add the bump mapping and everything. But we need to take care of at least this main one going down the side, because it's the most noticeable out of all of them. So what we're going to be doing is going into texture paint mode and using the clone brush. And basically the way the clone brush works in Blender's texture paint system is wherever the 3D cursor is in relation to your view, that's where it copies the paint from. So all we have to do is, to start with, let's just click like right here, maybe right here a little more, and we'll go into texture paint mode, and we want to click on that and choose the clone tool. So it will now paint whatever is under the cursor. And I'm going to turn the strength all the way up to 1 so that none of this texture seems showing through at all. And now we can just sort of start painting. And you might sort of reposition your view like that a little bit, just to sort of make that a little more efficient. And just sort of keep painting down like this. And you really only want to do it in the areas where it's most noticeable. We don't have to go ahead and paint through this entire thing. So just sort of switch back and forth between object mode and texture paint mode. Switch to object mode, reposition the 3D cursor just by clicking, and go back to texture paint. And we'll continue covering up these little seams here. Alright, let's sort of follow this up and see if there are any other really noticeable ones. Because it looks like there aren't. Yeah, that's probably good enough. I can't see anything from this level of zooming in, and probably not even going to render it this close. So we can go ahead and go back to object mode once we're done with that. And you want to make sure you save the image. You can save it as a different image if you'd like, so you can keep using this texture another time in another object. I'm just going to save the image because this is already a duplicate. Alright, so what we're going to do now is, if we go ahead and go to rendered view, so we can sort of see what this looks like. Let me just, can actually go ahead and merge these two. Oops, merge those two windows, because we can merge these two as well. It's not cooperating. I think it's because I'm in rendering view there. Alright, now I'll merge them. Okay. So if we take a look at this in rendered view, it looks okay. I mean, it's just a typical diffuse shader with a wood texture. We could add some glossiness to it, and that would really make it look a lot better. But we also want to add some bump mapping, and we want to adjust the color, so let's take care of all these things. I want to start with the color, because I want this to be a very, very dark purple kind of mixed with a black color. So we'll sort of see what we can do with that. And alright, we'll sort of move these over. I'm going to drag that down to give myself a little more space. I'm going to zoom out a little bit too. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is we want to add a brightness and contrast node, because I want to make this darker. So I'll press Shift-A, hover over color, add brightness and contrast. And let's start with something like brightness of -0.5 and contrast of 0.25. Let's see how that looks. Alright, so it's really, really red. As would be expected, I guess. Just because the wood was already sort of a red-orange color to begin with. We can go ahead and change that a little bit more later. Right now we're just trying to get the darkness to be about right. So I'm going to try -0.55 maybe. Alright, and that works pretty well. So the next thing we want to do is we do want to change the color. First of all, I think the saturation is way too strong, so I'm going to press Shift-A and add a hue/saturation node. You know, maybe it isn't. Let's just try adjusting the hue first. So the way the hue works is adjusting it gives you a different color essentially. So if we go up, let's see here, if we change this from 0.5 to 0.6, it gets closer to a yellow. If we change this from 0.5 to 0.4, oops, 0.4, it gets us closer to the purple that we're looking for. So I'm going to try let's try 0.25. And that's good. That's a nice color right there. Let me go ahead and zoom out a little bit here. Okay, so I'm going to move these over a little bit more. And let's see here. It's really, really dark now. And it looks pretty good as far as color and darkness goes. But we do want to have a little bit of lightness in some areas because we want to be able to separate it from the background. Like I sort of touched on earlier on the last tutorial with the lighting, we didn't have a rim light because we were going to be using a special effect in the shaders to help bring it out. So let's go ahead and take care of that right now. And basically, let me move these out of the way. I'm just going to mix this diffuse shader, using a mix shader, with another diffuse shader. Oops. We'll connect that, drop that right into there, and we'll bring this brightness all the way up to 1, or all the way up to white. All the way up to white. It is not cooperating, partially, I guess because I'm using the render view down there again. And instead of adjusting this factor to try to get some value that looks okay, because it's never going to look good that way, we want to use a Fresnel node. So press Shift-A, input, add a Fresnel node. And this will basically push the lighter shader off to the edges, so it looks like a rim light. So if I just plug that in right there, you can see right off the bat, it already looks much, much better. We can sort of zoom in to see this a little bit better. It looks like it might be a little too strong. So let's see if we can go ahead and kind of limit that a little bit. Let's try 1.2 to sort of push it to the edges a little bit more. It looks a little bit better. It might be too much, though. We'll try 1.3. Let's see how that works. And that looks pretty good. We do want a tiny bit sort of going over the dark spot, too, just because it gives it a glossier feel. And that way we don't have to add a glossy shader, and we can keep the amount of nodes we use to a minimum, which makes it a little easier to work with. Okay, so that looks pretty good, the shader for the wood does. And let me just go ahead and merge these really quickly. Oops. Go ahead and merge those. And let me just press Shift-B, drag a boxer on this, just so we can get a little preview. And let's go ahead and render a small segment of this, just to see how it looks. And as we can see, that rim shader, not the rim shader, the Fresnel node, really does help separate it a little bit from the background. Using more samples would also make it pop a little bit more, but for now that'll work just fine. So I'm going to press Shift-B and just drag outside the camera to get rid of the border. And let's bring the nodes back here. Okay. I'm going to maybe move that up a tiny bit more, 1.325, just to bring a little bit more of that in there. Looks a little better that way. Alright. So that's pretty much it for the wood shader. We should probably name it. We'll just name it wood. Alright. And that's all there is to that. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Since we're still on the staff, we might as well start with the gold shader next, just because that's also a material on the staff. So we're just going to come over here to the shader nodes, and we're going to click this plus sign to add a new shader. Add a new one there, and we'll change the name to gold. This is going to be a really simple shader. Really all I need to do is make sure we get the color right. So I'm just going to delete this diffuse node, pressing X, and we'll press Shift-A and add a glossy node instead. We'll plug that into there. And let's worry about the color later. Let's just get the roughness to about the factor that we want it to, and then add it to the areas on the staff where I want it to go. So we'll set the roughness to about, I don't know, 0.15. 0.2 is pretty blurry. We'll make it a little less blurry. We don't want it to be too sharp, though, just because it's going to be under the gems, and we don't want it to distract attention from the gems. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go into, I'm going to go into edit mode here by pressing tab, and I'm going to go ahead and hide the gems. I'm just going to right click those actually and press H to hide them, because I think it's going to be easier to work with this if we go ahead and do it this way. Now the fastest way to select these is just to hold down Alt and right click this edge loop, which is the, I don't know how well you can see that, it's the second one out from the center vertex there, and press Control plus twice. So now if we go ahead and just, let's go ahead and assign it, but let's also make the viewport color a little different so we can see what we're doing a little better. Alright, maybe that's a little too far. Let's try just those. That doesn't quite work either. I think I'm going to have to go ahead and add another edge loop there. So we'll just go ahead and press Control R, add another edge loop in there and move that out. Now we'll select that same edge loop again by holding down Alt and right clicking it, and we'll press Control plus, and we'll assign that. And that works pretty well. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that to all of these. We've got to add an edge loop to each of these again. Control R, hover over that part of the area, that part of the mesh, and we'll sort of move the mouse out, click there. Alt, right click this edge loop, Control plus, assign it, and we'll just keep doing this. We probably should have done this before we applied the mirror modifier. I think I'm only going to do it on this side though, at least in the recording, just to save time. Oops, forgot to add the edge loop, Control R, add the edge loop. Go ahead and assign that. And up here, Control R, add the edge loop, Alt right click, Control plus, assign it. And all the way up here, well, this is a little different. Control R, add an edge loop, Control plus, assign that. And we are also going to be adding the wood shader to this plate on the blade. I kind of forgot about that. We'll go ahead and take care of that later. So let's go ahead and render this and see how it looks right now. Obviously, it looks really silvery, which is kind of weird. But we'll leave it at that right now because this is an important point that we have to take care of, and that's the background. Right now, I think the background is just at its default gray. It actually looks a little darker than the default gray. But I'm actually going to turn the background all the way up to white. So I'm going to click Use Nodes and turn this all the way up to white. Now you may be wondering why I did that, because now it's affecting this and it looks horrible. But if we go ahead and, let's see here, basically just want to, let's try a little lower than that and see how that looks. Yeah, we'll make it more of a light gray than a solid white. But basically, we want to use this for the glossiness, because it brings out the shininess and like the metal, and then it'll also help with the gems later on, and it looks a lot better that way. But it affects the wood shader pretty negatively, so we don't want it doing that. So to fix that, in the world buttons over here, open the Ray Visibility tab here, and all you want to do is turn off Diffuse. So now the background will only affect glossiness and transmission. I don't think transmission really matters because we're not using this much in here. Well, we might be with the gems. But the glossy is still enabled, so it's still affecting this glossy shader, but it's not affecting the diffuse aspect of any of the shaders. So it makes those parts a lot brighter, but it doesn't affect the wood. And that's really helpful. So now we can go ahead and try to find a gold color for this. So I'm just going to kind of see here. We might want something sort of orangey like that. Maybe make it a little darker. Maybe something like that. I'm just going to use a hex value that I already set aside just so we can speed this up a little bit more. So I'm just going to use 7F6941. Yeah, and that looks like that was a little darker than before. It does actually look really dark. I'm going to make that a little brighter. Maybe something more like that will work pretty well. Alright, that looks pretty good. Okay, so we can go ahead and bring the gems back now. So just press Alt-H, and it'll bring those back. And it looks kind of nice just to have that gold ring sort of surrounding those parts. So let's take care of that plate up by the blade really quickly before we do anything else, because I want to make sure we take care of that. So I'm just going to split my view again really quickly, go to the UV image editor. I'm just going to switch this to the wood texture again. Go into edit mode, pressing tab, A to select everything, U to unwrap. I'm just going to project it from view. And as you can see over on the left, we can see where we sort of painted the texture a little bit to cover up the texture seams, so I'm just going to kind of keep it away from that. I'm going to rotate it a little bit again so that it's sort of following the grain of the wood. We'll have something like that, and then we'll just use the same wood shader. So let's go into rendered view and see how that looks. Should work just fine, but yeah, that looks pretty good. Might make it a little smaller though. Scale that down a bit. Something more like that. Alright, so that works pretty well, and then we can do the same thing we did before, where we can go ahead and go into edit mode here, and Control R to add an edge loop there. Alt, right click that, Control plus, and come back over here to the shaders. Oops. Click the plus sign and load the gold shader and then assign it. Forgot to do that. And again, we could do the same thing to the back, but for now I'm not going to worry about that, just to keep things going quickly here. Okay, So the next thing we want to work on are the gems. And the gems are also a pretty simple shader. Basically, I'm just going to go ahead and add a new shader here. We'll name this gem. And I just want this to be kind of a light pink sort of, yeah, I think a light pink color, maybe a light purple would work. We just want them to be brighter than the wood so they really stand out. So to do this, I'm going to keep this diffuse shader. I think we're just going to mix it with another shader. Let's go ahead and get a color for this. So I think I have a hex key for this as well. We'll just use AD, 8D, 3D96. Alright, so we just want sort of a kind of a mix between a purple-pink color right there. And then I'm going to press Shift-A and add a glass shader as well. And go ahead and use, it was D377E7. So this one's going to be a lot lighter, more of a bright pink. I'm going to adjust the roughness a little bit too. I don't want that to be totally sharp, but I do want it to be pretty close. So we'll make it 0.025. And the IOR value is probably fine. We could adjust that later if we have to. But for now, I'm just going to press Shift-A, add a mix shader, and combine these. And I want to set the factor to something pretty low, like 0.01. Let's go ahead and go to rendered view and see how that looks. And I believe I got that backwards. Might want to flip those around. Yeah, it looks like I did. But I could use a little more diffuse in there. So let's try 0.02. And that's a little more noticeable. So if we, let's see here, press Z, go back over here, go into rendered view. Yeah, we can see the gems stand out pretty strongly. I'm actually going to bring this all the way up to white after all, because it really helps the gems pop. Okay, so that works pretty well. I think I might actually go ahead and even make that a lot brighter, just so that stands out even more. Make that a little brighter too. Yeah, and that looks pretty good. So, yeah, that works really well for the gems. They pop out a lot compared to the wood, especially those ones on the top and along there. So that looks really good. And that's essentially it for the gem shader. Again, it's a really simple shader, kind of like the gold one. So now all we have to do is the blade. And this is going to be the most complicated out of all the shaders we've been working on. So, try to get through this as quickly as I can, explain it as well as I can. Basically, we're going to have to do a couple different things with this. We're going to have to get the metal, the actual glossy part of the shader, and I'm going to be using a texture as a reflected image for this shader. So that's a new element that we haven't used yet in any of these. And we're also going to use a scratches texture to sort of give it some bump mapping, which I just realized we forgot to do with the wood staff, but we can come back to that after this. And let me think here. What else? Yeah, we also have to add a sort of stained look to it. So I UV mapped it to another image and kind of got some stains on it to make it look like it wasn't a totally new shiny blade. And then we're also going to mix it a little bit with the diffuse shader so that we're still getting some shadows and not all reflections. So kind of a complicated shader, so we better get going on that. First things first, I'm going to press Ctrl-R in edit mode here, double click, and press Ctrl-E, mark seam, just because we want to be able to, you know what, I don't think that's necessary. It's such a thin area, we can probably just project it from view, just like we did with the plate there. So I'm going to split my view and open the UV image editor. And I am going to open, right here, this splatter image that I pull off CG Textures. And I'm just going to press A, U to unwrap. Well, let me sort of position it more so that the blade's facing the front a little better there. Something sort of like that will work pretty well. Alright, U, project from view. Oh, that's nice. Sort of. There we go. Press SX to sort of scale it in along the x-axis so we can make it more like the shape in the viewport there. So I'm just going to sort of scale it out and manipulate it a little bit like that. And this will add a lot of realism to the blade. So it won't look so brand new and shiny. It'll look a little more realistic. And I'll press tab to go back into object mode. And we're going to come back to that in a little while. But right now we have it UV mapped, so we don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to split my view and make this top window the node editor. Add a new shader, and we'll call this Blade. Alright. So the first thing we want to do is I want to get that sky reflection going on, because I'm going to use a sky texture for this, a cloudy sky texture that it'll be reflecting, and that'll help bring out the reflections, because right now there's nothing in the background, it's just a solid color. So let's go ahead and delete that diffuse shader for now, even though we'll probably be adding one later on. We'll press Shift A, and let's add an input node, and we'll use light path, because we want to be able to use the is reflection ray. No, not is reflection ray. I don't want to add a light path node. Press Shift A, and you want to add a texture coordinate node, is what I meant to add. And then we can plug the reflection value into the image that we add, and it'll use it as a reflection. So then we'll press Shift A again. We'll go ahead and add an image texture. Go ahead and open. And we'll just open this sky texture. And we'll plug the reflection input or output into the vector input there. And I want to make this darker too, so I'm going to press Shift A, color, brightness to contrast, because I know already that this image is too bright as it is, so we'll make this a lot darker. We'll try something like -0.35 for now. And we'll leave the contrast as it is. Alright. So the next thing I want to do is desaturate it a little bit because it's really blue. So I'll press Shift A, add a hue saturation node, connect those, and we'll lower the saturation to something like 0.25. Now, of course, I could have done all of this in a photo editing program beforehand, but I use this texture for other things, and I don't know, sometimes it's just faster to take care of that really quickly. If you're already in Blender, it's kind of convenient. And I think that's all we're going to do with that, so I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift A, and we'll go ahead and add a glossy shader. We'll plug that into the color. And let's set the roughness to 0, because I want that to be pretty sharp. Maybe not 0, we'll try 0.01, just to see how that looks. Plug that into surface, go into our camera view and zoom in a little bit, go into rendered view. Alright, so it's really, really dark. And that's obviously because the brightness is way too low. Let's try -0.035. That's a little better. Now it's starting to show up, and it looks more like an actual reflection there. What does 0 look like? It's actually pretty good. I think we might keep it at that. Yeah, we'll leave it at that for now, because we can always work with that a little bit more later. Okay, so let's see here. We can just delete that node then. Oops, delete that node. Plug that straight into there. Alright, need to leave that node, obviously. Alright. So the next thing we're going to do is, let me sort of move these out of the way. Let's go ahead and add that stain image that we were working with a little earlier. So I'm just going to go ahead and press Shift A. Let's add a mix shader. And I'm just going to leave rendered view because it's really slowing things down for now. And I'm going to go ahead and add a diffuse shader. And we want to give this sort of a kind of a red color, almost like a brick red, maybe blood red, depending on how this weapon's been used. That'll probably work. It looks like a pretty good color. Go ahead and keep something like that. We'll plug that into the second shader input. And then we'll press Shift A, add an image texture, move that over. And we're going to load, actually we don't need to go back there, we can just load it from in here. That splatter image that we just used. And we'll plug that into the mix shader there, into the factor input. So let's go to rendered view now and see how this looks. Obviously way too strong, and we have it inversed, it looks like. We actually want that on the top, and this one on the bottom. There we go, because that's the way it's supposed to look. So to reduce basically the strength that this is at right now, all we have to do, add another mix shader, or just duplicate that one by pressing Shift D, plug this mix shader node into the first input, and then plug this glossy shader node into the second, and then we'll just lower this factor, something like 0.45 to make it a little lower. And it looks kind of weird right now, but we're going to be adding some scratches and whatnot to give it some bump mapping, and then mixing it with the diffuse shader a little bit, so it'll look a little better then, but we can probably worry about that a little more later. Let's try 0.35 or 0.25. Oops, going the wrong way. 0.75. Maybe 0.65. We'll leave it at that for now. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is definitely add some scratches, because it looks way too shiny, even with this splatter texture added. So I'm going to go ahead and press Shift-A, and we'll go ahead and load this image texture. Click Open, go over here, and this is another texture that I took from CG Textures. It's a metal scratches texture. It should work pretty well for what we need to do with it. So we'll press Shift-A, Converter, Math, plug that value into the displacement, plug this color into the first value input, change Add to Multiply, and let's zoom in so we can really see this in detail before we change anything. Alright, so obviously it's way too strong right now. Let's go ahead and turn that down to something like 0.01. It's still pretty strong. Let's try 0.001. That's okay. It still looks pretty shiny. We can worry about that a little bit more later. No, I think those scratches are still a little too strong. I'm going to try 0.0005 to make them a little more subtle there. Okay, so that looks pretty good. They're kind of subtle. It still looks really shiny though, but we're going to fix that by adding a diffuse shader and sort of mixing those together a little bit. So let's do that now, because that's really one of the last things we have to do here. Let's press Shift-A, add a mix shader, mix that with a diffuse shader, and we'll lower the factor to something like 0.1. That'll probably work pretty well. For some reason it seems like it's not using the skies texture in the way I thought it would, because it still looks really, really shiny. But we'll keep working with this a little bit more. Alright, actually going to raise that a little higher to 0.75. So, looks like it's probably a pretty good factor right there. The reason I'm mixing it with a diffuse shader is also, in addition to sort of bringing down the shininess, is it adds a little more shadow to it. Because if you'll notice, the bottom of the blade, at least the part that's closest to the staff, has no shadow being cast on it, or it doesn't have a very strong shadow. So that's part of the reason we're mixing these, is to sort of add a little shading to the bottom of that. We'll try 0.2, I think. Will probably work pretty well. Okay, so that looks pretty good. It still looks really shiny. Let me go ahead and add this to the rest of these as well, so we can kind of see how it looks on all of them. Alright, it still looks kind of shadeless, especially these ones on the side. I think I'm going to make this a single user by clicking that 4 icon there. We'll name this Shadowed Blade, and we'll bring up the strength and this mix factor so we can bring in a little bit more of the shadow there. And then we'll load this same shader for all those other blades in the back, just because we sort of lost that shadow that the staff was casting on them. Alright, might lower that to 0.7. So, that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and give it a render and just see how that looks before we do anything else. So we'll go ahead and render this. Alright. Okay, so it is looking a little less shiny in the final render. Alright, that's pretty good. There's one other thing I want to do to the shader that might also help. I can just go ahead and press Escape here. And that is, I want to do the same thing that I did with the wood shader, where I add the Fresnel effect. So I'm just going to go ahead and mix that with another diffuse shader right there. And we'll go ahead and bring that all the way up to white. Press Shift A, input, use the Fresnel again, maybe 1.3, same value we used for the wood. Let's go into rendered view and see how that looks. And you're not going to notice too much of a difference, but basically there were some kind of really dark spots along the top of it there, and we fixed those up. So that looks pretty good. Oops, don't want to save as. Go ahead and render that again, just so we can sort of see how it looks that way. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty good. I might make the blades a little lighter at some point, because they do look kind of dark at the moment. So, they look kind of used. They still look pretty shiny. Then again, so does the rest of the weapon, so maybe it kind of fits. I think I might have used a different sky texture than I used the first time, because it's not really working the same way it was last time. But I hope it worked out when you tried it. And that's pretty much it for this tutorial. There are a lot of other sky textures and CG textures that you can use to help bring out different levels of, I don't know, shininess, depending on the texture you use and what size it is and what dimensions it is. All of those play a factor. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I also did some minor compositing. Really all I did was I added a slight glow to it, just to make it look a little more interesting. It's a pretty basic effect, and it didn't really add too much to the image. So yeah, at this point that's pretty much it. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial series, and I hope you learned something from it. And I'll see you on the next one.